Welcome back, everybody. So the previous problem is related to the new initialization of objects per scene. So every time we load a scene, we initialize the whole object, every object in that single scene. So we need to avoid this problem, and we say that we have P1 here inside this scene, and once you go from a scene to another, we created a new instance. So we have two unrelated instances. So this is an instance 1, let's say, and this is instance 2, and they are not related to each other. So every time we load a scene, we destroy the previous object and we create a new one. So we need to avoid this problem, because when we initialize the in-app purchase instance, when we initialize Soomla, okay, once we initialize Soomla, we have to keep it initialized, because we cannot have more than one instance of Soomla. So assume that this P1 is Soomla, this is Soomla, let's say Soomla instance X. Once we move to other scene, we're not gonna create Soomla again. We're not gonna have Soomla 2 here. Okay, we need to keep this instance among the entire game, so we need to initialize it only once. And in order to achieve this, we created, as I said, something called singleton. So with using singleton class, we have only one instance. So every time we use singleton class, we use this workflow. We started with awake here, and inside awake we make something called instance. So let's say ins. All right, and once we create ins and move to the next method, we have start method. All right, we do symbol check here, and once we do this symbol check, we just check if this instance is initialized. So if instance is initialized, we're not gonna create a new instance, we're just gonna keep the previous one. But in order to keep the previous one, we did the following. Inside the awake method, we need to execute the awake method only one time. So how you could execute awake method only one time? You could execute awake method only one time, or you could execute start method only one time for the whole project. So again, we have an object called X, and this X object gonna be created every time we call a scene. So every time we call a scene, we're just gonna call awake, we're just gonna call on enable, and we're just gonna call start method. So we need to achieve the following. Once we go to, for example, awake method, we just want to say, all right, is this X is initialized or not? If it's initialized, we're not gonna initialize it again. So we want to keep the previous instance. So if it's not initialized, create a new X, all right, and just move to the next step. So how we achieve that in code? In code, we can go to let's say here we have something called Soomla Initializer. So if you open Soomla Initializer, which is a singleton class, if you open it, you're just gonna see here, this is a normal class. We used Soomla, we use something called grow, and you can implement grow in the project, but I don't want to implement it in the current context because we just want to work with in-app purchase. So here we have Soomla, we have Soomla store, and we have also other things related to the Unity engine here. So this Soomla initializer is inherited from a class called model behavior, which is inherited from something called behavior, from something called component, and component inherited from something called let's say object. So this is the AN Soomla initializer, and if you go, for example, to the loading overlay here, and this is just an overlay inside the Soomla initializer. We use it inside to show an overlay, but forget about it. This is the constructor here. We just call the constructor once we initialize the game object. So we can go here. You can see this is how we define the singleton. We created something called instance, and this instance is public static game object. And what is the public static game object? It's a shared object. You don't have to create a new instance, so you can call this instance by the class name. So what is the class name here? It's Soomla Initializer. You can use this Soomla Initializer dot instance directly without creating new instance of Soomla. So this is the importance of static instance. We have here a Boolean, and this Boolean flag is used in order to make the call for this method only once. So here you're gonna see private Boolean only once is equal to true. So we use this we use this flag in order to decide when we need to only call a method only once. So here, once we start this awake method, we just check if this instance is equal null. Yeah, it's equal to null. And if it's only once, yeah, it's only once because it's true. We're just gonna go inside here. So what we're gonna do here, we're just gonna say only once is equal false. And after that, we're just gonna say instance is equal to game object, which is the current game object of this class, which is basically the one that we're talking about here, which is Soomla Initializer. Okay, and don't destroy and load. What do we mean by this? When we load a new scene, we're not gonna destroy this game object. Don't destroy and load. Okay, so we just call this method inside the monitor behavior. Don't destroy and load because we want to keep the current game object. So we save the current instance or the current game object to this instance, and we call this method don't destroy and load. All right, so this is the first time. What happens when we call this method another time? So we have this Soomla Initializer, for example, here in the start method. Here we have this instance, and if you go for other scene here, we have for the game in store instance, for example, you can go here. We have also another instance here. We have Soomla Initializer, same instance. Here we have Soomla Initializer, as you can see here. So once we go from the previous scene to this scene, we have the same instance, Soomla Initializer. So we just gonna check right now if the instance is null. No, it's not null because instance here is a static variable. So if instance is null, no, it's not null because we assigned it in the previous scene. So once we go here, we're just gonna execute this method here, else destroy object. And what do we mean by object? Object is just basically this new object here, because we have this object here called Soomla Initializer. We're just gonna destroy it. Why? Because we have a previous instance of it, which is saved here inside the script. So we're not gonna make a new instance when we move from one class to another class. And this is really awesome. So right now, also we use the same thing. We have something called Soomla Store. So I don't want to call this I don't want to call this instance every time we created a start method. So I want to call the start method only once. And why I want to call this start method only once? What I want to execute inside this, I have some sort of script inside the start method, and only this script need to be executed only once, and if the Soomla store is not initialized. So if only the Soomla store is not initialized, we have to, you can use the application here in case you want to use a grow, but I don't recommend to use a grow right now because first just focus on the in-app purchase, and later on you can implement the grow highway and the analytics of the insights here. So right now just keep the code as it is. We're just gonna check if the Soomla store is not initialized. What do we mean to do? What do we need to do? We need to initialize the Soomla store. So we just choose this flag from the Soomla store, and we check if it's not initialized. We need to initialize it. So if you go a little bit below here, we do here Soomla store.initialize, and we initialize the Soomla store here. Just basically, in order to initialize Soomla store, you cannot have many instances of Soomla, so you can have only one instance. So we use his Soomla store.initialize, and we give it the asset example that we developed in the previous lesson. So if you remember the previous class that we built all the we've built all the different items and different in-app purchase products here. So we just pass this instance to the initialize method for Soomla store. And also you can see here we have some events related to the Soomla store, which is known as store events. So we have to implement a method here representing each of these events. So here we have a callback for on Soomla store initialize. So once we first initialize the Soomla store, we're just gonna call this method. Once we change the balance of the virtual items, we're just gonna call this method. And once we have an error, we're just gonna call this method. And after that, we just start a coroutine here. We need to hide the overlay of the loading because we just do this just in case. And we have also something other thing which is related to Soomla store, Soomla storage initializer. So inside Soomla storage initializer, which is just basically a class inside the project, we have something called Soomla store initializer here. Soomla storage initializer. We have a static method called initialize, and we use something called key value storage. So in case you want to save something to the like a preference, but it's related to Soomla storage, secure storage, encrypted storage for Soomla, you can use set value and get value. So here I have, for example, Soomla referrer, Ahmad Naser. You can use the get value in order to get this value from the storage at any point of your game execution. So this is something related and how to Soomla, and you can use this storage also in order to save your data. So this is how you initialize it. This is how it's the best way to first you just make the events, and after that you initialize Soomla. Why make the events before initialize? Because you know initialization gonna execute this function, and this function must be implemented before you initialize. So because once you initialize, you need to call these functions, and this is what the best way how to do that. All right, and yeah, this is for the start method, and also we have another methods related to the Soomla. We're just gonna explore them when we talk about the store controller here. But this is the main execution part, and as you remember here, once we created this class, we're just gonna execute and initialize Soomla for only once, and this is achieved by using this way of singleton, and this is really a great way. And a lot of people who are trying to use Soomla and they don't have a lot of experience in Unity and about the object lifecycle, the mono behavior lifecycle, they're gonna have a lot of problems because Soomla is, and the Mindizor project is dependent on the mono behavior execution as we showed you before. So I hope this was very beneficial. I'm just gonna continue the next part and trying to explain to you what do we mean by each of these functions here and how to implement their action inside the game. So thank you again guys for watching this lesson. See you in the next part.